Morning, people. I'm tired. Do you think I enjoy talking about racism? I don't. Do you think people from ethnic minorities enjoy talking about racism? We don't. Would you enjoy talking about the fact that there are people and systems in power that want to ruin or end your life because of something about you that you were simply born with? Does that sound like fun to you? Because as a kid, I would always cringe so hard whenever anybody in our family would mention racism in public, because especially growing up in predominantly white towns, I didn't want people to think race whenever they saw a black person. I wanted them to see us as people. But the more I grew up, the more I realized that unless we push to change things, we don't get to be just treated as any other person. Which brings us to today's story. Last year, the Tories passed the Elections Act, which made it so you have to show photo ID when you go to vote. And lots of us warned that this would disproportionately impact people from marginalised backgrounds. Poor people, disabled people, young people, old people, people from ethnic minorities. Basically anybody who's less likely to have things like a driver's licence, or because they don't have enough faith in politics to keep up to date. And because young people and people from ethnic minorities tend not to vote Tory, we called this out as a deliberate attempt to rig UK elections, which Jacob Bloody Rees-Mogg actually admitted to live on stage.
Parties that try and gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections.
And on the day of the last local elections, 14,000 people were told that they weren't allowed to vote because they didn't have the proper photo ID. And the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Democracy and the Constitution just released a report as to what happened that day. For example, they found that it was actually more than 14,000 people who were turned away because of a lack of photo ID. They calculated that if this happened again at the next election, it would actually change the result of up to 16 constituencies. They found that travel passes for over 60s in London were accepted as valid photo ID, but not for over 60s in Liverpool. The report also highlights that some forms of ID, such as over 60s travel passes, are available to older people, but with no equivalent for younger people. So again, direct age discrimination against younger people, which is what the Tories have always wanted. They found that some non-white people were turned away from voting even when they had valid photo ID, and yet some white people were allowed to vote without showing photo ID at all. They say a disproportionate number of electors who were not permitted to vote appeared to be non-white passing. By contrast, all of those who were observed being permitted to vote without presenting ID were white passing. White passing means you think they were white to look at them. See, the thing is, I expected the racism to come via the fact that because people from ethnic minorities are statistically poorer, they're less likely to have a car, and therefore less likely to have a driver's license, and therefore less likely to have photo ID. I was not expecting the racism to come directly from the people who decide who gets to vote. There was also a medically vulnerable woman who wasn't allowed to vote because she couldn't take off her mask. So we're directly discriminating based on disability here. And this isn't me saying this to some lefty conspiracy theorist. Robert Buckland, who was one of the Tory ministers who introduced this bill, is one of the signatures on this document. Now, I mentioned before that people from certain backgrounds might have lost faith in politics, but it's because of shit like this, politics being deliberately designed to exclude them. But we simply can't afford to let them, because we've seen what happens when the wrong people get into power. Thousands of people die avoidably during crises, our economy gets battered again and again and again, our NHS gets weakened, and hate crimes go up and up and up. And it's especially fucked up because the majority of UK voters have voted for parties to the left of the Conservatives in almost every single election since World War II. So if all votes counted equally, none of this shit would be happening and we could all get treated equally as people. So while the Elections Act was a major step in the wrong direction, if we can work with the members of the Labour Party who overwhelmingly want a fair voting system and get them to force Keir Starmer to give us proportional representation, then we can turn the UK into a real democracy where everyone can vote and see their vote actually count. I'm Femi. Have a great week.